Welcome back to the second hour of our program. My op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com is titled, "In the New McCarthy Era, This Column Could Get Me Thrown in Jail." And which is exactly what happened to Ring Lardner Jr. Back in the day. And 9 of his colleagues in Hollywood who, were most of them were screenwriters and authors. And they refused a subpoena to testify before Congress about their communist affiliations, and as a consequence, they all went to prison for a year. That was the House Un-American Activities Committee. I'm arguing in this piece that the HUAC, as it was called, that started there. They were rolling along 3 years before Joe McCarthy really popped into public view. In 1950 was when they threw those guys into jail. 53 was the year, as I recall, that Joe McCarthy held his, well, actually, it wasn't even a hearing where he began. He started out, he was giving a speech to a women's group in Ohio County, West Virginia, in Wheeling, West Virginia. In fact, it was called the Ohio County Women's Republican Club. And this was the first of a 5-city tour that ended in Salt Lake City. And in February of 53, and this was in February of 1950. So it was the late 40s that HUAC was doing what it was doing, 47. Forgive me for being off by a couple of years. Anyhow, there in February 9th, 1950, Joe McCarthy is giving this speech. And at that point in time, he was like an unknown, obscure senator from Wisconsin in his first term. He was elected in 48. And so he'd been in office for 14 months at that point, 13 months. And so he pulls out this random piece of paper from the inside pocket of his sports coat, and waves it around and says, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 known communists in the U.S. State Department." And all the women in the Women's Republicans Club of Ohio County, West Virginia were like, "Oh, really? Oh, no." He visited 4 other cities. Now, I think it's important to note that at that point in time, there was a fairly broad consensus across American society that communism, at least the form that it took in the Soviet Union, was a real threat. I mean, keep in mind, this was just 17 years after the Holodomor, after Stalin had starved 4 million Ukrainians to death. This was as Stalin was, building gulags and imprisoning people and murdering anybody who spoke up against him. The so-called communist miracle had been revealed by this point to be basically a brutal anti-democratic tyranny. And the Soviet Union had just exploded their first nuclear weapons 6 months before McCarthy gave this speech. And 6 months later, in June of 1950, the Russians, with help from the Russians, North Korea would invade South Korea, kicking off the Korean War. So this was a point in time where when you said that somebody was a communist, you were essentially saying, they're sleeping with the enemy. They're on the wrong side. And so when McCarthy said that there were 205 communists in the State Department, it made national headlines. Now, in his subsequent 4 cities on this tour, now McCarthy was a fulminating alcoholic. In fact, he died of alcoholism in May of 1957. May 9th, 1957 was the last day he drew a breath on this earth from liver failure, from his drinking in all probability. But he changed the number. He started out saying it was 205, and then he went down to 57, and then by the time he got to Salt Lake City, along the way he had said various numbers, including 81, but he never actually named a single communist. Never did. And that famous hearing, by the way, that everybody remembers, where Joe Welch said, "Have you at last no decency, sir?" That was not his permanent committee on investigations. That was a whole separate thing. It's kind of an interesting backstory, by the way. I don't talk about it in my article, but Roy Cohn was Joe McCarthy's right-hand man, the guy who later became the mentor to Donald Trump. And Roy Cohn was gay, and his lover, whose name I believe was Shine, I could be wrong, it might have been Shine, was the guy that was representing the Army. I'd have to go back and look at one of the articles from that time, but Roy Cohn's lover tried to get out of being drafted for World War II, and he got drafted anyway. And well, actually, this was even after World War II. He got drafted anyway. The draft was still going. And Cohn was furious about this. And so McCarthy, on behalf of Roy Cohn, convened what were referred to as the Army McCarthy hearings, where Joe McCarthy tried to intimidate members of the military, members of the Army, because he was, trying to get revenge for Roy Cohn's boyfriend. And that was the moment when the famous, "Have you no decency at last, sir?" Well, that's, in my mind, that's exactly what Jim Jordan is up to. Is the exact same thing. That what they are trying to do, what they will be doing, mark my words, is intimidating, threatening, using bluster and the threat of imprisonment. Like I said, the Hollywood 10 went to jail. They went to federal prison for a year. Is intimidating people into going along with this Republican agenda, or going along with this Republican turn toward fascism here in the United States. I mean, Ring Lardner Jr., what he wrote was, quote, "One of the first acts of the Republicans who took control of Congress in 1946 for the first time in 20 years was to convert a temporary committee, HUAC, which had been investigating fascist sympathizers during the war, into a permanent committee concentrating on the left." Boom, off goes Ring Lardner to prison. And so, here I am pointing out the same thing that Jim Jordan, the same Jim Jordan who talked with Donald Trump multiple times during the insurrection and then refused to speak to the January 6th committee about what Trump told him about the substance of his conversations with Trump. That Jim Jordan is going to be the chair of this committee. Just consider how this could play out. Back in April of 2009, the FBI published a report. Now, this was 4 months into the Obama presidency. The FBI published a report titled "Right-Wing Extremism, Current Economic and Political Climate Fueling Resurgence and Radicalization Recruitment." This followed by 1 year a similar report on left-wing extremism that the FBI had put out. Now, both of these reports were prepared by the Department of Justice under President George W. Bush. This one just happened to get released as Obama had just come into office a couple months earlier. And the right went nuts. John Boehner said the report was, quote, "offensive and unacceptable." And he was outraged that it used the word terrorist to, quote, Boehner, quote, "to describe American citizens who disagree with the direction Washington Democrats are taking our nation." And that, that's a fairly mild response. I mean, Boehner didn't threaten anything, but he said this is terrible. And so, Obama pulled the report. But imagine today if somebody in the FBI put together a report on right-wing extremism. This committee would have the employees, the federal employees, dragged before them. Those individual people who worked on the report would have their names outed, their addresses outed, their homes would be surrounded by right-wingers with guns, their lives would be threatened, their lives would be turned upside down. As happened to over 2,000 people before Joe McCarthy's Permanent Committee on Investigations. Over 2,000 federal employees lost their jobs because they got dragged before Joe McCarthy's committee and were tainted thus as being suspected of being communists. And this is exactly, in my mind, I might be wrong, and I hope I am proven wrong on this, but I don't think I am. This is exactly what Jim Jordan and the Republicans are planning on doing with this new committee to investigate the weaponization of the federal government. Is they are trying to create a zeitgeist. They're trying to create a widespread fear among federal government employees, particularly in the FBI, about any kind of investigation or any kind of public statement or any kind of report or any kind of work at all that might reflect poorly on Republicans in Congress who have participated in sedition and treason.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And of course, if they really repeat what HUAC and McCarthy did, they'll start coming after people like me too. Maybe you next.